Today is Monday, March 23rd, 2026, and today is National Chip and Dip Day, which feels like the culinary equivalent of admitting that the real star of the snack table is usually whatever the chips are being dragged through. Welcome to This Day in History from, wait, that's random. I'm your host, C.L. Burns. On this date in 1775, Patrick Henry stood inside St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, and delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history. Give me liberty or give me death. At the time, the American colonies were in a strange in-between moment. Tensions with Britain had been rising for years. Taxes, trade restrictions, military presence, but open war had not yet officially started. Delegates from Virginia had gathered to debate whether they should organize and arm a colonial militia. Some still hoped the conflict could be resolved peacefully. Patrick Henry disagreed. His speech argued that Britain had already chosen force, and that waiting any longer would only weaken the colonies. The interesting thing about this moment is that the exact wording of the speech wasn't written down at the time. What we know today was reconstructed decades later from people who were present. So the famous line may not be a perfect transcript, but the effect of the speech was real. Within weeks, militias were mobilized, and less than a month later, the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired at Lexington and Concord. Sometimes a speech doesn't change history by itself, but it can push people toward a decision they were already circling around. 31 years later, another moment of decision happened much further west. On this date in 1806, the Lewis and Clark expedition began their return trip from the Pacific Ocean. The Corps of Discovery had spent the winter at Fort Clatsop, near present-day Astoria, Oregon. Their original mission, ordered by President Thomas Jefferson, was to explore the vast Louisiana Purchase territory and find a practical route across the continent to the Pacific. By the time they reached the ocean in November of 1805, they had already traveled thousands of miles by river, horseback, and foot. But the return trip was almost as difficult as the journey west. Snow blocked mountain passes. Rivers ran dangerously high during spring thaw, and the expedition still had to cross the Rocky Mountains again. The reason the journey mattered wasn't just the distance. Lewis and Clark were systematically documenting what they saw. They recorded maps of rivers and terrain, descriptions of wildlife and plant species, details about Native American tribes and trade networks. Their journals transformed huge sections of the continent from blank spaces on maps into documented geography. In other words, the expedition didn't just travel across the continent. It helped explain it. And then there's a moment in history that's much smaller, but somehow just as lasting. On March 23, 1839, the abbreviation OK appeared in print for the first time in the Boston Morning Post. It was part of a short article using a joke abbreviation, All Correct. This might sound strange today, but newspapers at the time were briefly obsessed with playful misspellings and shortened phrases. All Correct was a deliberately incorrect spelling of All Correct. The abbreviation stuck. And yes, it's OLLKORRECT. That's where the OK comes from. Soon it started appearing in other newspapers, letters, and telegraph messages. One reason it spread so quickly is it was short, easy to write, and easy to understand. 2 letters. That's it. Over time, OK became one of the most recognizable words in the world. It crossed languages, borders, and cultures. And today it's used everywhere. In conversations, text messages, business documents, and even aviation communication, which means a joke abbreviation from a 1839 newspaper quietly turned into one of the most universal expressions humans use. Not bad for 2 letters. And speaking of communication that travels across cultures, Akira Kurosawa was born on this day in 1910. Kurosawa became one of the most influential film directors in history, known for movies like Seven Samurai and Rashomon. What made his work remarkable was how clearly his storytelling translated across languages and cultures. His films used visual composition, movement, and pacing to communicate ideas that audiences anywhere could understand. In fact, several of his movies were later adapted into Western films, sometimes almost scene for scene. It's another example of something crossing boundaries, just like a speech, a map, or even a two-letter word. If you step back and look at these moments together, something interesting starts to appear. Some would say a pattern. A speech pushes people toward revolution. An expedition maps an entire continent. And a joke abbreviation becomes one of the most widely used words in human language. Different kinds of influence, different scales. But they all show how ideas, once released, can travel much further than anyone expects. Anyway, those are a few of the things I ended up reading about while wandering through March 23rd. Stop by tomorrow and we'll see what other strange corners of history the next date decides to reveal. If you want to know more about me or the work I do, you can find everything at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and I appreciate you stopping by.